Thank you for coming to this webinar. As John say, I have a long experience in cybernetics. I did my PhD in cybernetics with Raul in Birmingham in the 1990s. And I had the opportunity also to meet Stafford and to develop a close relationship with him. So the VSM has been my inspiration, and the work from Stafford and Raul and other cyberneticians has been my inspiration, and I have devoted my life in the last 30 years to continue understanding and applying the VSM. I am a very practical person. I was a consultant before being an academic, and I really like the challenge of putting these ideas into practice. I have learned over the last 30 years that the VSM for me is a really powerful theory to understand the management of complexity in organizations. And my main aspiration has been to try to disseminate these ideas, to try to make it more accessible and easier to understand to people. So this book in particular that I'm going to tell you about, that has been launched by Routledge a few months ago, is a book about the viable system model, my own interpretation of the viable system model, and the way that I have tried to clarify some aspects of the theory and the way that I have been putting it into practice over the last few decades. So the first thing is about what's different about this book from other VSM books. It's a textbook. I wrote it as a textbook for basically students who want to learn about the VSM. One of the major criticisms of the VSM is that it's a very cryptic, difficult to understand theory, and many people just get off the VSM because they find the Stafford books complex to read. They don't have the time to go through the deep theory. And also there have been many criticisms on the VSM over the years that have stopped many people getting interest and trying to understand better the idea. That on one side. On the other side, I've been very passionate about the learning about sustainability and trying to clarify how the VSM theory can be useful as well to think not only about viability, but about viability and sustainability. The main question that I've asked myself is how can we get self-organized to increase our possibilities of long-term viability and sustainability, not only in businesses, but also in society? So the other aspect of the theory that I have tried to explore has been how can we use the VSM not only for understanding how to improve performance in businesses as Stafford originally did, but also how to improve, how to manage complexity in very large, complex organizations like communities, like societies. So I've been doing a little bit of exploration in that respect. When I talk about in the book, then I explain the way that I understand the idea of a viable and sustainable organization, and basically it's an organization that is capable of independent existing, like Stafford said, without severance from its niche or from future generations which will inhabit it. To do that, it needs to co-evolve with the niche, so it needs to be structurally coupled with the niche. Need to have a rational use of resources without abusing the resources. We need to develop products or services that are welcomed by the stakeholders in the environment. Need to improve the well-being of the workers and the communities where it operates, and to preserve the biodiversity of the ecosystem. So how can we use the VSM to try to address issues of not only financial sustainability of the business, but sustainability in the wider sense? So one of the aspects of the theory that I really like, and that I also learned a lot about that from Raul in his book with Alfonso Reyes. They do a lot of emphasis in learning and understanding learning, the idea of understanding complexity and learning. For me, this is, I think, one of the core aspects of the theory of viability is how do you understand that to manage complexity, you really need to develop your capability of learning, both with yourself in your relationships with other people in the organization and in the relationships between the organization and the environment. So in that respect, the way that I understand the VSM is as a relational theory. It is about relationships. It's about how can we develop an awareness, an understanding of how can we ourselves make decisions to be more effective, to perform better in doing what we do, and to do it in a more sustainable way. So I put a lot of emphasis in the beginning of the chapter. I try to explain the way that I understand what is a learning team and what will be an effective learning team, and how can we relate the ideas of variety, complexity, and learning. So the first chapter is basically explaining this understanding of viability, sustainability, learning, and complexity. For me as well, the VSM is one of the most powerful theories to explain how to deal with complexity in organizations, and is more practical, more detailed, and give us more tools to understand complexity than other, let's say, more modern complexity theories. In the second chapter, I explain my view of the bubble system model with these clarifications. I basically explain what Stafford and others, Raul and others have explained about systems 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. My emphasis is in the relationship between the systems 1 and the environment. I think that it is there where operational performance happened, and it is by focusing in how this sustainable is this relationship with the stakeholders in the environment, we can progress more towards an idea of viability that is stronger, more robust. I do explain a lot also about the relationships, about the relationships between the different, the systems 1, 2, 3, and between system 3, 4, 5, and the environment. So I do, let's say, an exploration of the way that I understand the original theory. My emphasis is in managing complexity and in clarifying the organizational principles that are behind the theory. Issues like what I call responsible autonomy, that is being autonomous but responsible, accountable, no, self-regulation, cohesion, the issues of agile management that now is very popular, but Stafford was definitely one of the pioneers on agile management. The ideas of real-time performance measurement, managing hedonics, adaptation, and the emphasis that I put in the book is about self-governance, how this understanding of viability help us to create an organization that is that is capable of self-governance, and also of more what I call sustainable self-governance, that is being able to do what it wants to do it in a more sustainable way, and be able to adapt itself to be capable of governing itself in a more sustainable way in the long term. So that's that in the context of the idea of recursivity, that this theory can be applied at different levels of organization. As Stafford said, every viable system is contained in a viable system and contains other viable systems. So if we take these principles at different levels of organization, from individuals to teams, to businesses, to communities, to societies, so VSM is a very powerful theory that can help us to explore really different aspects of viability and sustainability and governance at different levels in businesses and societies. In the third chapter, I explain what I call the self-transformation methodology. Again, I took a lot of inspiration and learning from Raul, from his BiPlan methodology. When I did my PhD, I used BiPlan and expanded a little bit an aspect of information management in BiPlan. And over the last 20 years, I've been clarifying my own interpretation of the methodology that I call the self-transformation methodology, that is basically inspired in action research, and the purpose is to facilitate systemic learning in the organization. The methodology, the current version of the methodology is a version that has these stages that goes from thinking about the organizational identity and ethos. Sometimes I do a little bit of boundary critique using ideas from critical system thinking here, recursive mapping, try to understand subsidiarity, the different levels of subsidiarity in an organization, and then a preliminary diagnosis and full diagnosis. I start identifying issues of governance from the beginning and try to focus the diagnosis on issues on governance. And then alignment between strategy, structure, and technology, and information technology. And then the stage of what I call the defining self-transformation projects. That is, once we have covered an organization and identify some pathologies, what can we do about it, inspiring VSM criteria? How can we make a decision to change? What can we change, and what will be the different stages for changing the organization in the direction agreed? I do and then all the issues about monitoring sustainable performance, how to use KPIs and how to focus on issues of that are critical for the viability and sustainability of the organization, and how to start monitoring them in real time as much as possible. So those are like the typical stages of the methodology, depending on the project, the amount of time, resources, and so on. Sometimes I can go through all the stages. Sometimes in some projects I can go visit some of the stages, depending on the purpose of the projects. But in general, I try to frame the analysis with this idea. In chapter 4, icons, that was a chapter that I wrote to do during the COVID, and I was very impressed by the amount of learning that we had at the individual level, the society level, and the business level with the COVID. Very impressed thinking about the theory of viability and how everything can be completely transformed by a crisis like the COVID. At that level, one of the things that I got inspirations was in Alena Leonard's work on the individual as a viable system, and I was and also Mark Johnson's work. And then I was thinking during the COVID, the different aspects of activity that were interrupted or disrupted by the COVID. How could we think about ourselves as a viable system, and think about the kind of self-management and self-development that we could do just by doing a reflection about ourselves, our own viability. Also, I use a case study that I did with one of my students in Colombia, Andrea Martinez, and she did her PhD using doing a VSM analysis of a Mexican service company that offered cleaning services. And in that work, the most interesting experiment was she managed to monitor sustainability, critical indices for sustainability, for implementing the sustainability strategy of the company, and how she managed to monitor that in real time, and the learning that they generated, and the progress that they managed to do by adjusting the structure following VSM criteria, but also focusing on improving implementing the KPIs on sustainability that they have agreed. In that chapter also, I talk about the two case studies. Well, one is more theoretical. That is about thinking about the pathologies, structural pathologies on the NHS in England, and then thinking about a recent consulting work that we did with John and in an NHS trust, in which we look first of the whole, the trust as a whole, and then we concentrated in a particular specialist unit, in a surgery unit, and then I reflect on the experience and the learning about to reflect on the viability and sustainability of this unit. In chapter 5, I go through education. I had a lot of passion about the application of VSM in education, and I call it fits like a glove, because if you think about VSM from this perspective, then really VSM gives you a lot of insights in terms of what is systemic learning, no? And if you think on systemic learning in the context of an organization, then, and in an educational institution, then it's really, really powerful. So in this chapter, I explain my own understanding on systemic learning. That is basically, again, about the relationship between you and yourself, you and others, you and the environmental niche or society where you live, and the kind of learning, systemic learning that you can develop. And then I tell the case study of a Romanian school that was a consulting project that I did with one of my MBA students, Vladimir Pop, who owned this school in Romania. And for a year, I did some consultancy with him. And it was a really exciting project because the whole school, we managed to really prepare the school for a process of expansion that it was going through by reflecting about the problems that they have. And basically, they had a problems of what Raul would call the control dilemma. The headmaster of the school was very, very centralized, and she was trying to take too much control, and she was stopping the capability of the schools, the kindergartens, to develop themselves. So a very beautiful project, and I tell the story about this project. I actually used this project to explain the methodology in the previous chapter. And then I tell about two smaller case studies. One was developing systemic learning project business that we designed with a Colombian master student of mine, Gabriela Ramirez, that we designed in a consultancy to develop a systemic education resources online. We created the platform, we created the business, we educated the resource developers, we interact with the platform designer, and it was a very beautiful project. And she managed to, we managed during this consultancy just to design the first bit, that was the development of the online resources and complete the platform. So it was interesting because I was using the VSM to design a startup organization. And then I also mentioned in that chapter another case study that was with a Colombian university called Magdalena University in Santa Marta. They decided to use the VSM to implement their sustainability strategy, and we used a combination of Teams Integrity and VSM. That was another consultancy that have lasted for the last years. It was actually just an academic collaboration more than a consultancy, but I've been, John and me have been helping them to develop this way of looking at the university in the different aspects that they do, academic and extension and research, and how they manage to design their sustainability strategy using Teams Integrity exercise, and then how they manage to reflect that in the structure of the university in terms of implementation. It's an ongoing case study. They are still working with that. In chapter 6, I develop, I do a bit of exploration on organizational viability and sustainability in terms of mapping and designing or complex organizational networks. By rereading Stafford again, I realized that Stafford was very aware. I mean, obviously, his inspiration was in McCulloch's idea of neural networks, and Stafford thought, well, we can design an organization as a neural network. So why not, if that was the inspiration of the VSM, we could consider using the VSM to design intentionally complex organizational networks that in this moment is what everybody is needing, and many organizations are moving towards a network kind of a structure. So my intuition is that we could use the VSM to design the metasystemic management of a network and allow self-organization in all the nodes of the network. So in this chapter, I present a case study that was with a Colombian Dutch researcher, Frans Bart Van Hoff, and he did a project in Mexico of coordinating a network of 100 businesses, Mexican businesses, very big businesses, to do a project of cleaner production. And we use the VSM to design, to reflect on the organization of the design of the network, and the learning from this experience helped him to design an equivalent network in Colombia a few years later. So that was a really interesting way to test this hypothesis. And then with another PhD student, Al-Fadal Al-Hinai in Oman, he used the VSM to design a startup company, national company, that was the Omani Broadband Company. It was a really interesting experience. Not only we and I helping, John and me helping doing a bit of consultancy in the beginning. That was really interesting. We did some recommendations that were not taken into account at that moment because they were paying very expensive consultants that they follow the other consultants' recommendations. But 5 years later, they realized that what we were suggesting was more effective, and they shipped to that. And the other research that he was doing that I done with at least 6 previous PhD students is try to understand the relationship between VSM and social network analysis, because I am convinced that there are some recurrent patterns of interaction in networks that if we can rebuild them with a VSM light, we could learn a lot about VSM and social networks. So that's an ongoing work that I've been doing with several PhD students. Alfadal did a very nice work analyzing like thousands of emails from the Omani Broadband Company. And another case study was in Colombia, that was with Martínez Giraldo, a friend of mine who had worked with me in other cybernetic projects in Colombia. We did a consultancy. She was at that point the director of the, I call it the National Broadband Network. It had 8 regionals and it had different nodes. And the problem they were having, they had a problem of governance because the regions were too autonomous and there was no governance at the national level of the networks. And that was creating all sorts of problems with the customers and with quality and services. So that's a really interesting case study of how to, how digamos, let's say a network can get completely out of control. The other case study I present in that chapter is with another of my PhD students here in England, Julia Vanilova, and she developed, she used the VSM. She was working in the wind farm design in Hull. And she basically wanted to use the VSM to try to map the networks of people producing these wind farms and to try to coordinate a strategy for offshore wind, for the offshore wind industry. So it was a, let's say, theoretical work, but I mean, with a lot of interaction with the suppliers, and she managed to do so, to come to some interesting conclusions. Then the chapter 7, I talk about sustainable self-governance. What I have done is I've been very passionate about trying to explore the possibility of using the VSM in communities. And then in this chapter, I show 2 new works with 2 of my students in Colombia, applying the VSM to think about self-governance in communities. I basically use some criteria to clarify the issues of governance. And then we applied one project that lasted for a year, was with a student of mine, Carolina Duque, that is an anthropologist. And she was working with this community called the Jaguares del Yurupari, and trying to understand issues of governance. And then we designed a project in which we try to clarify in very simple language the VSM, the questions of governance from the VSM perspective. And then she went and led some workshops, and between the 2 of us designed the questions. She interacted with the indigenous using cartoons, and it was a really beautiful project, and we learned a lot with the indigenous about the issues of governance that they have. A similar project happened in Rosario Islands in the Caribbean with the MSc students from Externado University, Carlos Duran, and other anthropologists who fall in love with the VSM as well. And we managed, this is a national park, and we managed to map, this is him doing the VSM workshops with the locals, and they have to take care of the ecosystem. And we managed to sort of clarify like the primary activities, the systems one, like the community organized activities to take care of the tourism, sustainable tourism, take care of the natural resources, all the bits of justice, land use, and so on. And we managed to clarify the roles. And again, there was a lot of learning, and that was important for the community, and that helped them actually during the COVID to be more effective in the way of managing the relationship with the tourism. In chapter 8, I go into talking about systemic change. This is another topic that I'm very curious about. How can we facilitate massive systemic changes? This is more a reflection about the historical uses of the VSM at the national level, and thinking if we have gone from individual to businesses, to regions, to communities, and then we can think at the national level how I tell about a few experiences using the VSM at the national level. My inspiration again was Stafford with his CyberSteam project, and my PhD that as I said, I did with under Raul's supervision in Aston. And then I tell the story of 4 VSM projects that I did in Colombia. One of them was to design a monitoring system to monitor the impact of the national investment to fight project. It was called Reunirse. It was a project in which we learned a lot about how to put into practice this idea of generating early alarms in a participatory democratic system with participatory budgeting and with people very much in the community and academia and industry and government working together to monitor the impact in the local level of these programs, these investments. And I talk about another work that we did that Raul was also one of the international advisors that was trying to redesign the national school system. Very beautiful project that unfortunately never got to a conclusion, but we worked for 2 years and managed to do a general diagnosis of the national school system and to design a couple of prototypes of what will be a new systemic school organized with cybernetic principles. And then I talk about the re-engineering the National Auditing Office. This is a project that Raul was one of the academic consultants, international consultants. And it was inspired, it basically inspired us to rethink the auditing process in the National Auditing Office. We redesigned the re-engineering of the National Auditing Office. And for 4 years, we did a VSM analysis on 60 organizations and produced a lot of cultural and structural changes in that organization. And another project was doing the National Environmental Information System in the country. Again, we map the VSM, we map with the VSM the whole country, and we learned a lot about understanding the country like eco-regional management and creating the thinking about environmental management from the as meta-systemic management of the different ecoregions of the country. So very interesting, very practical, lots of changes in the way of approaching the environmental strategy of the country, the way of understanding information systems, and so on. And the final case study was the most recent work that I did in England, coming back to the 21st century. And that was during the COVID in the same trust in which we tried to map understand the performance of a trust, of this trust during the COVID. And basically we used the VSM to map the command structure that they were using during the COVID and to try to learn about emergencies and about crisis management with the VSM. So basically the result is trying to demonstrate that the VSM could perfectly be used intentionally to design systemic changes. To finish, I mentioned in chapter 9 what I see that is the research landscape with the VSM. There lots of complementarity with agile models. Very interesting, the topic of continuous developing VSM for network design. Very important to try to progress VSM theory. I think that this is an urgency in this moment, trying to to develop new ideas on neurophysiology, cognition, things like intuitions and emotions in the original theory. As I said, managing organizations in emergencies and crises, and the topic of community viability and sustainability. I see a lot of complementarity between VSM and other more, let's say, more fashionable now theories like sociocracy, holocracy, teal organizations, and so on. So this is it. And basically, what I say by the end of the book is that Stafford will be saying, it took me only 50 years, but the time for the VSM has come. And I think that Stafford will be very happy now. The number of papers and books on the VSM is just escalating. I think that people are finally realizing the value of the VSM. And we have a lot of people that are really excited about this. We have created with Elena is the president of the Meta Forum. John and me are co-chairs, and Vanilla is a member, and many of us, Stafford's friends and colleagues, continue to come to the Meta Forum. We have a webinar series, and we have an annual conference. This year's conference is in Manchester. You are all welcome. We have a lot of registrations and a lot of interest already. The topic is viability through emancipation, or the hidden agenda of viability. I am convinced that some of the criticisms about the, for instance, from critical system theorists about the VSM come from people that haven't understood the real issue of VSM, because when you put VSM in practice, the only thing that you can do, if you do it properly, is you will challenge the power structures, because VSM is an hierarchical model that really is trying to generate more autonomous, more networked kind of organizations. And if you understand that properly, many of the original criticisms are reversed. So I really see the VSM as an emancipatory systems approach, not a functionalistic system approach, as Mike Jackson and other people may have said. But of course, everybody is free to have their own opinion. So that's my opinion and my hope that the VSM will continue developing and growing, because we have a really vibrant community. So that's all for me.
Yes, going to go on, clap, why not? It was fantastic 30 minutes, Angela.
Thank you very much.
I really don't know where to start, but I will, because it's my privilege, because I've got the talking stick at the moment. Is this idea of and we'll go to emancipation, because I think it is an for me, it is an emancipatory model of how we run an organization. And if it isn't, then we're doing it wrong. And I think that's sort of kind of embedded in the principles that I've certainly read and understood. But what it made me think about as you were talking is because there's an incredible array of case studies. It's fantastic. What are the common characteristics that you found in the people that you've worked with that have embraced the idea? So what sort of distinguishes people who embrace cybernetics and VSM from those who sort of kind of go, oh, I don't really think I like that? What is it about you or them or it that works?
Well, that's a very important question, because for me, the successful experiences have always been with people that have had already, that have leaders that have already understood the ideas of system thinking. Yeah, so you don't have to do the work of convincing the leaders that systemic thinking is the right thing to do. It is in those cases that my experiences, my consultancies, my teaching have worked. When there is a little bit of this awareness. For instance, two of the big projects that I mentioned here, the ones that Raul was involved, we had Herman Bula, that was the leader of the organization in both cases, and he was the boat of Stafford Beer, and he was convinced that the VSM was the right thing to do. And it was the same in Romania. My students were those students that were the most passionate, were the ones that looked for me after learning the VSM and told me, I want to put that into practice. And then that happened in Romania, that happened in the hospital in Hall, that happened in the Tinta experiment. No, the same, the VSM in the environmental sector in Colombia. The Ministry of Environment was a devout systemic thinker. Yeah, and he was looking for systemic, powerful systemic model of organization. So, I mean, I think that I would say that in those cases is where people really this work. If you have to start from scratch with a person that is a autocratic, centralized, power freak kind of person, it's better not even to start. It is not going to work.
Oh, I like taking them on, Angela. They're fun. They're never more wrong than when they convince they're right, which is always good fun. Rory, you have your hand up. Would you like to say, ask, question, something?
Yeah, so I had two questions. One was a sort of sub-question of the other. You talked about a lot of cases when you implemented the VSM model in organizations, and I wanted to ask the difficulty or some of the major or main difficulties that you found in the practical implementation of the model, because to give sort of an example to exaggerate my point of the difficulty of it is, I'm doing a placement at GE Aerospace, and their materials planning department told me that they all speak the same language and that they've all done the same supply chain management accreditation. So they're all operating off of the same language, the same model, the same mode of thinking. And I was wondering how difficult it would be to change something so fundamental about an organization. And then the sub question that I had from that was about information systems, because I'm currently studying information systems development. And I wondered about the compatibility of information systems, particularly ERP systems, with the VSM model, because you've got stuff like SAP and Oracle that run on very specific modes of operation. So I was wondering about their compatibility with the VSM, because I think that would link to your ability to practically implement the model in organizations. I hope that all makes sense.
Yeah, completely. Yes, I'll start by the second question, that is the easier one. So 100% compatible. My PhD was trying to find this compatibility, and I am a computer and systems engineer, or I was before becoming a cybernetician, and I found this really exciting, this complementarity, because the VSM provides you with the understanding of the organizational context and structure and, that you need as a computer systems engineer to make sense of where the technology should be put on. And I haven't found yet any other theories that are more compatible. So they work very nicely together, and there is no contradiction in terms of IT and VSM. Even with all the new software developments, no problem at all. And the other question about the most difficult bits, I do think that the most difficult bit is to train a group of people in the organization that is capable of understanding VSM language and VSM theory, and is capable to continue leading the process when you are gone, if you are doing consultancy. I always, that's why I put so much emphasis in the methodology. I call it self-transformation methodology, because I really believe that if you manage to do this, to this coaching on the VSM language and distinctions, people get so excited when they understand the theory that after you are gone, they continue using the theory and they continue applying the same generic principles. But this is challenging, and for me, this is the most difficult thing that not always happens. Sometimes you go, and then people start fighting between them, and then they don't continue using the VSM theory. Or if you don't manage to create a good enough learning coaching process, then the whole thing can disappear after you are gone. So this for me is still the most challenging bit, and I'm still learning. I don't have a 100% satisfactory answer.
In 1959, Angela, Stafford published Cybernetics and Management, and it was a moment of enormous joy for me in reading it to discover that he'd generated algebra for learning and forgetting. And whether it actually works or not, I really don't know. My sums were never really that good, but the idea of information decay in particular was one that was particularly strong. So I find that really interesting. So to go back to the character question, go back to the people question, that I've taught a lot of people about the VSM, I've taught a lot of people about cybernetics, and of course you turn your back for 5 minutes and the organization that you worked with, has evolved its own version. So, so the people that remain behind live with their interpretations of the thing, but also over a shortish period of time, with turnover of staff, particularly in large organizations these days, you can sort of get quite a rapid decay of understanding and knowledge. So, so making it sustain, and one of my favourite organisations, Fusion 21, I've been working with them for about 12 years, and it's thoroughly embedded in everybody. It's great, but you have to watch it. Chris, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, I think I'm going to ask a question that's about the same as you've just highlighted, actually.
Oh, sorry.
Angela, that was brilliant. Thank you. You put together loads of ideas that are important to me. But I guess my question is, you start by saying you're a very practical person. So sustainability and self-governance, because I think when VSM is applied effectively, we'll have a successful organisation. So what then protects it from the people from the outside who see it as being successful and want a part of the action, as it were? If we're reliant on self-governance, I just, it links a bit to what John's saying, how quickly things could be forgotten and systems could be corrupted by people that join it. And I'm not trying to be cynical or skeptical about this, but I just wonder whether you've encountered that and how you see that as being addressed in the self-governance concept that you put forward.
Yeah, well, I appreciate your question, and I like the challenge of my pragmatism, because I have to admit that, yeah, I love practice. I love testing theories, but I like also developing theories, and many of the things that I put in the book are still theoretical, in the sense that there are more aspirations that I can say in practical terms that I have achieved everything. I mean, as I think that anyone who knows the VSM knows how difficult it is to prove that it has worked in practical terms. And the topics of sustainability and governance are some of the most messy, fluid, difficult, abstract things. And we know that businesses in practical terms will aim to be more sustainable, will aim to have good governance, but there are many aspects of their interaction with the environment that take them in a different way. And pragmatic issues, like, for instance, let's demonstrate that we are sustainable so that we have a good reputation, but let's make sure that it doesn't cost us too much to be very sustainable. So all these paradoxes about sustainability, greenwashing and everything are still there. What I think that the VSM helps is to put things on place. It's like when you do the VSM mapping with the ideas of sustainability in the back, you can highlight issues like, for instance, the ethos, the System 5 ethos. How is it implemented in practical terms? Are there System 2 issues in terms of the values, the cultural norms, the process design that are trying to rethink processes in terms of cleaning, clear production, or aren't there? So the VSM, the structure, if we just enrich it a little bit with these ideas of sustainability, then it is easier to help the businesses to be more pragmatical and more down to earth in terms of how are they going to implement a sustainability strategy on one side. Yes, go on.
So effectively, visibility and awareness through a kind of learning culture in an organization makes it more likely to be successful. I would agree with that. The aspiration, we could get trapped if we get too idealistic about it, but the likelihood of the organization being more viable and sustainable with a VSM, absolutely. I take that's going to be, if we make that more visible and people aware of it, then I get that. The mapping's important. And
creating the culture of self-governance and accountability. Yeah, if you put it with the idea of sustainability at the same time, it's not only in terms of making sure that we are profitable, but it's in terms of sure that we are socially and environmentally responsible. And when you do these discussions in the coaching process with people, then people started creating this awareness, and this learning, this awareness becomes like what I call a collective model. And this collective model start to make effect in its own, because people learned and ground these feelings, and then there is a social control when the decisions are made. People are saying, oh no, but let's not forget that we also have to take into account these aspects of ethics, sustainability, and so on. So it's just a learning process, but I think that the VSM is very beautiful as a structure in which you can embed these kind of ideas.
Thank you.
Angela, I don't want to add anything different to what you have said. Thank you very much for providing us with all these case studies, and more than that, that you have put them together in a book that everyone can get hold of and develop further the ideas that we have been working through over the years. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Raul, because you, more than anyone else, have taught me a lot about the VSM, and you know that.
That's really good. So talking of learning, I'm going to pause on you, Angela, if I may, at this point. So a really well made point, Raul, because we have two young people in the room who have only very recently stumbled across our area of interest, and so starting at completely the other end of the animal. This point. So it feels good to me to pause on the discussion with Angela to look at the work that Corneliu Cotet and Matthew Day are starting to work on alongside me and a couple of others. So for context, we are collectively building a thing called the Seasonally Agnostic Railway Model for Network Rail, the aim of which is to be able to assert the impact of extreme weather events on the performance of the railway and tell the customers before it happens rather than after it's happened, and then start to drive performance and sustainability and all sorts of other aspects of the railway through that sort of model. And so we've built prototypes, and they're working. They are, as you would imagine, deeply rooted in the idea of lots of interacting homeostats. But what we found inevitably was that there were three areas in which we needed to do some serious work. And serious question one was for Corneliu, as it turns out, who's now, Corneliu and Matthew are both pursuing fully funded PhDs at Loughborough. And the question that we've given to Corneliu to address is, how good a decision can you make given that the data quality is pretty poor? So how good can we be at making decisions given that our data set will always be incomplete, out of date, and in some cases just wrong? And the question two that Matthew was daft enough to take on is, if this is going to be a learning architecture, and it's a model that is designed for adaptation and learning, if it's going to do that and it's going to do it at the right level of consideration, then it's going to end up with something of the order of 30,000 individual bits of machine, each learning independently about their bit of the railway, and then starting to share and aggregate data across the entire railway, which is a sort of scaling problem of machine learning that, frankly, I think only cybernetics has the thinking skills to address. So what I've done is Matthew and Corneliu presented their work so far to a sort of supervisory panel made up of sort of industry and academics last month, and on the basis of that I've asked them to come along, share with us what they're up to so far, what the challenges and opportunities are, and where it's all going to go, they hope. And I'm hoping that this collective wisdom that we have sitting on this call will be able to A, throw ideas back at them, but also be able to see the links between all the work that Angela's been describing in the various diverse organizations and the work that we're now working on, and hopefully the one will inspire the other. So Corneliu, I'm going to start with you because you've got question one, if that's okay. If you'd like to come on, introduce yourself, and you've got about sort of 15 minutes to sort of share your ideas. Then everybody will do Matthew second, and then we'll sort of get back into the conversation that builds on it all. So Corneliu, over to you.
Thank you, John, and thank you for the introduction. Hello, everybody. My name is Corneliu. As John said, I'm a PhD at Loughborough. I've just started about 5 months ago, 6 about now. So I'm just the beginning of understanding of what cybernetics is and how system thinking and other processes can help into this issue. And I do have short presentation to show you. Just give me a second. I have to apologize because I'm only using mouse right now. I've spilled my drink. So share screen. Okay. So can you see my presentation?
Yeah.
Great. Right. So, as John said, the first question of this problem is actually the reliability of decisions. So how do we take decisions without appropriate information or data or things around assets and management and so on? And the things I'm going to share with you today is a bit of background information, which John has also shared. The purpose of my PhD, the theoretical background, and basically the part one of this PhD, which I'm currently conducting, the progress, what I've done so far, and some of the conclusions I've had or not, we will see at the end. And the project basically is sponsored by Network Rail, and we are trying to develop a tool called SARM, which is supposed to help this situation and somehow make the industry and rail industry in the UK better. If we will be going to achieve that, we have to see. But before we get into the problem, I have some background. And the first thing that makes this possible and actually makes this problem real is climate change. So because of climate change, we have more occurrences of severe weather, and it's a certainty that we will be continuing to have this, and the severity of these instances will increase in the future. And in turn, this sort of weather creates all kinds of damage, disruption, and not only to rail infrastructure, to all kinds of infrastructure, but in our case, to rail infrastructure. And this leads to delays, cancellations, lost revenue, and unsatisfied customers, and so on. And some of these events can be like excessive precipitation, which can lead to landslides, flooding, which can destroy partially or totally bridges or rail, heat waves, which expand and contract the tracks, and high winds, which can deteriorate signal systems and overhead electrical equipment. So we can already see and understand that there's a variety of possible repercussions of weather, and there's a variety of methods also to how to deal with this. Now, the second thing would be the adaptation of infrastructure and building resilience into the new infrastructure that we're going to build. We are talking a lot about high-speed rail, but some of these problems are still not resolved. So one of the things that is essential for the industry is to systematically and accurately assess weather patterns and actually identify what the repercussions of this weather are going to be, and then act accordingly. But this is quite difficult to do in real time. And when you also don't have the information, the full picture, especially around assets and what the resilience of those assets are, is quite difficult to do. And conventional approaches to managing this sort of problems are failing. So we see that rail is quite difficult to manage, and we can see actually, I think a few days ago we had a new derailment which was in the Netherlands, which are quite advanced in the rail industry, to put it like this. So it's quite severe. We can see it happening everywhere. It's particularly happening also in Eastern Europe, where I'm from, but that's a totally different problem there. We also have sudden shifts in weather. So we can have, especially in the UK, we can have good weather and 5 minutes we have really bad weather. So how exactly do we manage that sort of situation? Because in rail, for example, when rail operators take a decision, based on weather, they do it 2 to 5 days before the event. So they do it if they actually know that some sort of extreme weather event is happening. But when it happens quite quickly and in real time, it's quite difficult to manage. And the Stonehaven derailment in 2020, which is really the point where all of this started. So the Department for Transport has created some sort of report, and in which they try to understand the problem, how it happened, and so on, and what the future plan is to basically avoid this in the future. And from that, SARM has been developed as an idea. And we can see here what happens. So for some time, I think the problem was pinpointed to various reasons. And in the end, it was just found out that the accident happened because of a drainage system that wasn't even supposed to be there. So it didn't really serve a purpose. And what this tells us from the beginning is that, well, the operator of the infrastructure, in this case Network Rail, didn't even know that there is a drainage system there. So that's a problem in terms of how we manage data and what do we know about our infrastructure. So if we don't know about it, how exactly we can avoid the accident in the future. So one of the first objectives in this sort of area is that we need to develop a reliable database with all the assets that we have. And what happens, for example, in the spatial industry is that a lot of movement is happening in mapping what's underground. So in this case, we can have drainage systems or cables or similar assets and infrastructure. And the third one would be the creation of new tools, practices, and frameworks to deal with this problem. So as John has described, the Seasonal Agnostic Railway Model is supposed to help in dealing with this problem. So initially, it will collect information about weather, forecasts, asset specification, maintenance of the assets, and in order to determine what conditions they can operate. And then these conditions will be monitored to determine how trains may be delayed in impending circumstances. And this in turn will allow operators and Network Rail as well to anticipate problems and basically try to avoid disruption as much as possible. And now to go to my PhD, so to answer the question of the decision making, I will go to the questions, aims, and objectives I have so far. This probably will change, but the aim of my research is to explore decision making under conditions of data uncertainty and utilize the principles of cybernetics to transfer knowledge for enhancing decision reliability and system resilience in the context of rail management. So what this really means is that I'm trying to look at other industries, especially open environment industries, and understand what do they do, why do they do that, and how can this be transferred to our problem. Is something there that can help us? And for sure, there has to be something there to help this problem. And some of the aims is how, as I said, is how uncertainty is managed in other industries and other environments. What are the limitations and challenges associated with decision-making under conditions of data uncertainty? And what changes occur to these limitations in our context? And how can cybernetics principles be applied to the decision-making process in our case in order to solve the problem, or at least attempt at solving it? And the objective so far was to develop, the first thing is to develop a systematic literature review to see exactly what's out there, what can help us, what can we use, and what do we need to develop further. And that was the initial plan until I figured that, at least at the moment, this is not possible because the area is so broad and the area of decision making, I mean, and uncertainty is so broad that trying to conduct a systematic literature review from the beginning is just almost impossible because you get results like maybe 2 million papers. And obviously, I'm not a robot yet, so I can't go through 2 million papers. But I will come back to that later. And the second objective would be to construct a logic for categorizing data into levels of availability, reliability, and significance. So obviously an operator like an infrastructure operator like Network Rail has a variety of data in terms of assets and infrastructure split in different levels. And some of this may be more important than others. So we might have things that we know of which are important, and in the same time, we might not have data about certain things, but we might find out in the future that they're not even important to know about. So after I create this logic, I'm supposed to use it in determining how data uncertainty affects rail and decision making. And especially around weather and maintenance. And after that, it should go into a framework for the decision making, which then it should be implemented and integrated into the STAR model itself. And at the end, if possible, I would like to evaluate this framework. Is this framework good? Is this framework doing what it's supposed to be doing? Do we need to include something else? And so on. And so far, the part one, which I'm at the moment, theoretical part one, has trying to answer the philosophical question of decision-making under uncertainty. And basically, as I said earlier, is just me trying to put the question into other industries. So one example I found so far, which is, I think, relevant, and I like it very much as well, because I'm coming from the airline industry, is that in the aviation industry, we have lots of uncertainty, but in the same time, they manage it very well. So, for example, if we have a storm and the people that manage a certain route decide that, okay, we know the storm is there, but in the same time, we know that from an engineering point of view, that the airplane can actually make this trip. So the only downside is that we're going to have some upset customers, but we're going to save, I don't know, 20,000 pounds worth of fuel if we go through it. So what happens usually if the storm is not too big is that the planes and the route will proceed through that storm. And then when you think about it from a philosophical point of view, well, that's a risk, right? But is it an acceptable risk? Apparently, it is an acceptable risk because we know very well what the plane is capable of, and we act according to that knowledge. Is that possible in the rail industry? Well, it is possible, but we probably need years of development of frameworks and changing in the organizational structures and practices and tools as well. And the schedule so far was for me to build a systematic literature review, but I've gone past that because it was just not possible. So what I'm doing now is trying to write a scoping review, basically trying to identify the areas that are most suitable to analyze in a systematic literature review, to which will limit, the papers and books and knowledge that I'm looking at. And so far, what I found in writing the scoping review is that the areas that I'm supposed to look at is, well, of course, management of uncertainty, data-driven decision-making, climate change, stakeholder engagement, statistics, and transport planning. And at the second level, this industries will go into other things like strategy, adaptive strategy management, information theory, artificial intelligence, resilience adaptations, and so on. So I'm trying to access the knowledge in all of these industries and transfer it to the problem that I'm trying to solve. Well, progress so far, I have identified the potential areas to be explored, at least right now. And one of them is the role of cybernetics in problem-based research, which is basically the foundation of this entire project. So how can the use of control systems and feedback improve the efficiency and effectiveness of decision-making, especially when we talk about complexity and uncertainty? And yes, the second point is exactly this. So what if the data used in this mechanism is not reliable? And how can cybernetics transfer knowledge from other industries to basically help us decide or put a number on this unreliability? So when we go to, let's say, an operator, okay, there's 80% of this event happening. How do we get to that 80% and how do we justify that in the same time? Decision reliability, the second thing is decision reliability under data uncertainty. So what are the limits of the data? What exactly do we know about the data, and what do we know, what we don't know about the data, sorry. And then how do these limits affect decision reliability? And under such circumstances, how can predictability be ensured? And as a last point would be, how can artificial intelligence be scaled to work with identified limits? So if we have a system and we try to use machine learning and artificial intelligence, how can we scale this? And the point C, which is more from a broader point, is infrastructure resilience and climate change. So this would be the point of trying to justify everything we're doing, because this is not only trying to improve efficiency, but it's a project for the future, right? So we know weather is not going to improve; it actually is going to get worse. So, what sort of strategies ensure that availability of comprehensive data need to be identified? So, if we move with this project in the future, we certainly need a totally big shift in data governance. So how do we work with data? What sort of data we need and what sort of data we don't need? Because at the moment, we also have lots of data we just don't need. So how do we go about to actually have a good strategy in governing data? And what is the impact of poor coordination on rail, freight, and passenger services? Well, obviously, this is customer service, lost revenues, lost time as well. So how do we go about as well in this sort of system from a broader point in trying to not have this poor coordination which we have at the moment? And then how to develop more effective collaboration and coordination between rail stakeholders. So this is exactly what is supposed to be happening, right? We think that there's at least I thought that there is a quite tight collaboration between all the rail stakeholders, but in reality, it's quite it's quite sad, because we can see that there isn't any collaboration at all in some places, and it seems like although the industry should go into one direction, it feels like everybody goes into a totally different direction. So how exactly will this tool help? Because even if we develop it in the future, we'll probably have lots of reluctance in using it. So how do we solve these issues? And what are the best practices for adapting rail infrastructure to climate change would be the last point. And to conclude, basically what I got to the point I got so far is, as I was saying, I couldn't get into a systematic literature review. So what I've done was to develop, and I'm actually still writing it, is a scoping review to identify areas that I need to go more deeper in the systematic literature review. And where I am at the moment is with a paper which is called From Chaos to Control, a scoping review of cybernetics and system thinking as enablers for infrastructure resilience. And what I'm basically doing is exactly this. And I'm still trying to pinpoint the exact areas, but I'm getting somewhere, which is good, because I was getting a bit frustrated at a certain point. Everything was so broad, and I couldn't pinpoint the exact knowledge I need to look at. And conclusions is exactly this number. So this is the number I'm looking at the moment in my scoping. And although in the past days I reduced this a lot, I'm still looking at a lot of papers because of the areas I'm looking at. And I'm trying to reduce that to an acceptable number, probably around 1,000 papers that I can actually analyze and look at and transfer that knowledge to my problem.
Brilliant, thank you. So if we, if you unshare at this point, Corneliu, because what we'll do is we'll go straight on to Matthew, and then we'll come back to you. And you know, the comment we all have to make at this point is yes, there's too much in there at the moment. We all know that, and that the filtering process will be really entertaining, but it's kind of where we need to start. So. There, everybody, you've got the sort of the starting question, a couple of comments that came up in the chat during that. Richard's pointed us some work which will be helpful, which is good. Thank you, Richard, from the sort of rail industry and weather point of view. I mean, bear in mind what we The railway is 200 years old, so it's 4 times the age of the VSM, and twice as old as Stafford would be if he was alive today, I suppose, but or thereabouts. What's really interesting about it compared to the aircraft example that Corneliu used earlier is, we know pretty much everything there is to know, even about the mechanical stuff of an aircraft. We know almost nothing about the railway at any sort of any kind of deeper level of analysis. It's quite disturbing when you dig into it, how little you can find. So Matthew, wherever you're hiding on my screen, I can't currently see you. You're there somewhere, I'm sure. Oh, there you are, up at the top of the middle. If you would like to do your bit as well now, and then we can pick up all these threads and pursue things through. Matthew.
Hello, can everyone hear me okay? You have to let me know if it works.
It's working. You've muted yourself, Matthew.
Am I unmuted now?
Yeah, you're unmuted now.
Okay, perfect. So hello everyone, this is my presentation, and my research is centered around cybernetics for artificial intelligence. Now, the presentation is going to be a very quick overview of who I am and what I've been up to. So unfortunately, you won't be getting any crazy theories just yet. So yes, my name is Matthew and I started my PhD in October last year, and we're currently at Loughborough. And I always enjoyed maths and physics back at school, and I took a computer science degree from the University of Reading. And my hobbies include gaming, reading, music, and a little bit of exercise. And here's a little nice picture of where I'm from, Bracknell. Okay, SARM. We've had a bit of an overview on SARM already, which is good. And yes, this research is in conjunction with the development of SARM, which is trying to provide a decision support tool for the rail industry. And it's trying to effectively predict the effect of weather on the rail infrastructure and the operations. And I'm sure we've already discussed a lot of the benefits that systems like the SARM can provide. You can do a lot of optimization, improve safety, and all that good stuff. But here's the problem. SARM, it's not quite broken, it's not on fire like that, but it's struggling to give reliable predictions. And this is mainly due to 2 factors. One is the obvious complexity of the weather system and the railway and how they interact together. And the second main factor is the quality of data, which we've already been discussing, and Corneliu went over that nicely. So how do we solve this problem? How can we fix the SARM? Artificial intelligence is the solution, the proposed solution for now. So machines have now officially surpassed humans in a lot of problems that a lot of people previously thought impossible. Like chess is a good example with AlphaZero beating human performance in chess. Image and language processing, they were always thought to be a hard problem, but they've seemed to be cracked. Very good progress being made. I'm sure a lot of people have heard of ChatGPT. That's been getting a lot of publicity. And a lot of these pictures in this presentation have been generated by AI, like these 2 and a lot more. So I think these and some other examples really show the potential for using artificial intelligence and try and bringing it into industry. So that's what we're going to try and use to improve SARM. My research. So current artificial intelligence, it heavily relies on a lot of statistics, and these methods require a lot of reliable data. They use a lot of computation, which can be very expensive and uses a lot of energy, which is considerably bad for the environment because it's using a lot. And they also, all these methods exhibit a very bad lack of adaptation. So they're very brittle, very susceptible to noisy data, and this makes them struggle in real world scenarios. Like, I'm sure everyone's heard of self-driving cars coming soon, but they never seem to come. It's because there's a lot of real world scenarios where these methods just break down. So most of these current methods are very unsuitable for the SARM project. So my research is trying to beat these restraints, beat these limitations on the current methods. And I'm going to explore how cybernetics can be utilized to do that. And then we'll aim to develop a novel approach to building intelligent systems, which are going to be reliable, adaptive, robust, and efficient. The main methodology, and it's going to consist of a process of literature review, theory building, experimental testing, and then disseminating the outcomes. And it will be a cyclical process, so we can experiment theories, see how well they work, and then come back and have a more direction for a next literature review, the next cycle. And all this will be implemented in real world scenarios, which will provide a very rigorous evaluation of what we're doing and keep the project relevant to the problem, because we want it to be implemented and we need it to be working in these messy real world scenarios. So yes, this will help us do that. So far, we are currently 6 months into this research, and so far it's been extensive literature review, which is still ongoing, and there was kind of 2 parts to it. So the first part is going over all the current methods that are currently used in artificial intelligence and how they're used in these industries and what are their advantages and disadvantages. And that's going to help us find some, maybe they've already worked on loads of good ideas we can use and adapt them, and we can identify all the disadvantages where we need to fix. The second part of the literature review is all about cybernetics, because we're very new to it. I've never heard of cybernetics before I started. So I jumped in head first, and we're just trying to investigate what are the fundamental principles of cybernetics. That's going to help us develop both a conceptual framework for the SARM and the problem, and also where we're going to take the research. And so far, I've also developed a lot as a researcher throughout the university experience and training, and I hope to keep that going. Okay, so that's mainly what I've been up to and what I'm doing. So now I'll just give a little overview of my experience with cybernetics so far. So cybernetics, it offers a lot of insight into building intelligent and adaptive systems. Being the science of control and communication, I like to think of it recently as a science of processing information into action. And that's where the core of this research will be, utilizing some ideas and theories from cybernetics and trying to integrate them with modern technologies and integrate them with some of the aspects of the modern methods that are working. And obviously, yes, cybernetics has a lot of aspects to do with artificial intelligence and building intelligent systems from its roots. So it's a great place to pick for trying to build these systems. So my experience, as I've said, I've only been doing this for about 6 months. So for me, I've seen it as a story of people, and I find that really interesting. So here's a picture of a few of the people. I couldn't get them all, so sorry if I missed your favorites. But these are some of the most influential people that I've been reading about so far. Originally, when I started learning about cybernetics, it was through Ashby and his 2 books. I started with an introduction to cybernetics, and then his first book, Design for a Brain. And I think they're really good, so I recommend reading them if you haven't. And then I've skimmed over a few bits of Beer and his Designing Freedom, which is a very good book to read. And then more recently, I've been interested in Gordon Pask and also with Beer and their work on controllers and the biological and chemical computers. And that takes you into von Forster at the BCL, the Biological Computer Laboratory, where they were working with a lot of people, including McCulloch, and they were building intelligent systems. So that's where my research has been heading most recently, into the BCL and their work they were doing there. And I thought I'd include Weena and Shannon because they were right at the heart of the start of cybernetics, and they did a lot of work on information theory, which I think is a very important concept in cybernetics. So it's also a story of ideas. These are some of the main ideas that I can take away. The most obvious ones for cybernetics would be feedback, stability, and regulation. And I think stability is such an important concept to learn, especially when you're considering, let's say, for example, the railway it doesn't seem like you want it to be stable because you want it to be moving, but stability doesn't directly mean not moving. So you can say, for example, you want the delays to be stable at 0. That's just one example of stability in the railway. I really like the idea of adaptation from cybernetics and how it's sort of a second evolution, like an evolution of over your life. I think the ideas of communication is extremely important. It's one whole half of cybernetics, and there's a lot of things to take from that, from the work in information theory, and then how can you use that communication to collaborate and achieve goals while working in a team, effective communication. And I think there's a lot of that in the VSM. I don't want to touch too much on the VSM because I'm no expert, and there are some experts here. The idea of a black box is very important, input and output. And I think you can consider the world being completely made up of black boxes, and you're learning about how the black boxes work. And I included a bit about abstraction there as well. And I think that just shows how a black box, you can have two different black boxes made up of completely different things, but appear to be the exact same, based on the same inputs and outputs. I think that's a very important thing. It's very related to metaphors. I think that's a core concept in cybernetics. One of the main core concepts everyone's heard of is variety, the number of different possible states. I think very ties directly into entropy and information. And I've included the yin-yang as a nod to binary and the bits, and how they figured out that was a very convenient way to represent variety as a base too. And I've recently been really getting into the work on self-organization, and about how you can have very simple rules and build up some intrinsic randomness. So it's like semi-random, semi-deterministic organization. And I think that's a very key idea I've been thinking about recently. And they've also, finally, a story of some machines as well. They put these concepts into some machines to show off. My favorite example is computers. I think if cybernetics didn't exist, the computer wouldn't exist. And I think they were right at the heart of the most fundamental ideas that computers are built on. So I've included some pictures of the early computers. Human-machine interfaces, they're very important. There's no point in building cool, fancy machines if you can't use them. So, and we are humans, so human-machine interface is a very important thing to consider when you're trying to build these systems. And adaptive controllers, I like including the picture of the homeostat. I've been looking at that and researching it quite a lot and how it works. And I like how it shows off a lot of very cool concepts of this adaptation and having semi-random, semi-deterministic, by having an intrinsic pool of variety from all the possible connections, and it adapts to use them like a controller. So that's a bit brief overview of what cybernetics has been to me so far. The next steps is we'll start building some theories and putting these concepts together and using them and integrating them with some of the modern techniques and some experimental testing on. There's a lot of benchmark tests we can use which allow us to evaluate their effectiveness very rigorously against all the current methods. We will start having some small scale integration with the railway data, and we can start testing it in real world scenarios and see if it holds up. And if it doesn't, we can identify how we can make it hold up. And of course, continued literature review and development. There's always more to read. As Corneliu pointed out, there's thousands of papers coming out all the time. So there's always continued literature review. And finally, feel free to get in contact. I'd love to hear some feedback, and I like sharing ideas if you just want to have a chat or interested in keeping up with how the research goes. I've included my email. If you want to email me, I'm happy to talk. The end.
Brilliant, thanks, Matt. Do you want to get rid of your slides so I can see all the happy faces? Brilliant. I really like the notion in there of the story of people. The railway is 20,000 miles long, 30 yards wide, and populated by something like 40,000 people permanently, and another 60,000 who hang on to the outside. And everything that's going to happen with them is going to be about their stories as well. Picking up a couple of earlier comments. Somebody said here that there's surely a logic exists for this already. Some logic exists for some parts of what we're looking at, but when you look at the scale, Stafford, I think, was running the Chile industrial economy on fax machines and telexes 50 something years ago. The railway would probably in some senses consider a fax machine an advance on its current technologies. They're not great at some of this stuff. It's the ability to deal with it all at scale, in close to real time, that sort of takes us down the road that we're going down with some of these things. Rory, you can come in with your first question.
I don't have a question, but what I do have is some possibly incredibly naive points to make, which everybody always seems to love when I come along. The first one is that I'll use an analogy because everyone loves my analogies as well. Everybody's oven is different. So not everybody's 200 degrees is 200 degrees on the oven, but provided you know how bad or provided you know the direction in which it is not 200 degrees, you can just about figure out how to work it. So I put down on my whiteboard whilst I was listening that uncertainty isn't the problem, it's randomness in the uncertainty. So if you know, or if you can at least find, possibly if there is one, a pattern in the uncertainty and the randomness that you're dealing with the data, then it might be easier to pick out the problems and then make some decisions off it. again, incredibly naive points for two very difficult PhDs. The second one I had was a conversation I had with my data analysis teacher, where she talked about, because Matthew mentioned statistics and computers or artificial intelligence's reliance on statistics. And she mentioned how big data is actually posing a threat to statistics, because she said that a lot of statistics is developed based on using sample sizes, based on using small amounts of data. And she said one of the problems with big data is that statistics is becoming less useful because it wasn't designed for such large amounts of data. So I just wanted to mention those two things in case they lit a spark in anybody's brain.
I'll give you a response to the second one. The big data problem, it isn't undermining what we do with statistics. It is presenting some new challenges, and one of the big problems is that, as Corneliu has found, if you go into Google and ask it a question, you can get 39 million wrong answers in 0.29 of a second. And actually, there's a requirement of human intelligence to be able to filter and think about how we ask the question. And similarly with big data, there's a challenge for how do we ensure that the big data we're seeking and the big data we're using is actually relevant and contributing to the problem that we think we're trying to solve. So there's a really interesting one there. I love the idea, the randomness in the uncertainty. Matthew, Corneliu, any thoughts? And Elena, I'll come to you next.
Well, I suppose it's not really
when I
random.
hear that, Corneliu, you go ahead.
I suppose it's not really random in our situation. And sometimes I think that the biggest problem is that we don't know what we don't know. Right? So we have an idea of what we should be needing, but I think in certain points we might encounter data that we don't even know we need. So I don't particularly think everything is random. I think there's actually quite a very specific structure in what we need and how the data is going into our problem. It's just that how do we develop that data if it doesn't exist? So if Network Rail doesn't have the processes to acquire this data, well, we won't be able to somehow solve the problem. So how exactly do we make this decision knowing that we probably won't have this data, right? So is this the right decision? What's the risk of it? What's the acceptable risk? What's the consequences of this decision? So I don't think it's that random. At least that's my opinion.
Part of the motivation for Corneliu's PhD, of course, is that one of the things that lets us do is illuminate for the railway the extent to which it doesn't have the data to make the decisions it is actually making on a day-to-day basis. It's making all these decisions, it's running trains despite the weather. The reality is, though, of course, it makes the decision badly. The decision is somewhat indefensible from time to time. And when they get it wrong, and they do, then maybe they end up killing people, which is not a great position to be in. So actually, the first thing you do is illuminate the lack of data, which points back at the organisation, the challenges it gives it what we call guilty knowledge. We tell them the size of the hole in their data, and they have to then think about the hole in the data as much as the decision. But they do these things. They've done one today. It's windy and wet outside, so they've run a decision-making meeting today where they've decided to run certain trains at different speeds. They may or may not be right. If they're wrong, the downside consequence is people are later home than they need to be. If they're right, then they may have saved a life, and it's very, very uncertain space to work with. Elena, your hand is up.
Yes, thank you for three very interesting presentations. I wanted to make a couple of comments and ask a question. One comment was that Stafford used Bayesian statistics, the Harrison-Stevens filtration process, to look at a time series and ask whether an unexpected variable represented a step change, a slope change, a random variable, or a transient. And that was something that basically enabled them to screen input and see what they needed to deal with. The second point, coming from a North American perspective, is that the tone at the top is really the problem. We've had a lot of accidents here, and it's because they've cut back on the maintenance. And they are saving money above all, so that they can satisfy their shareholders. But the question is there an approach to anti-fragility in the data by having redundant digital and analog computers looking at the same factors?
Guys, answer. You're the PhD students. That's a really interesting one, Elena. I mean, the notion of anti-fragility, I love that. What we get in there. So, guys, any thoughts? Matthew, you're the computer whiz.
Yes, I have done a bit of research on Bayesian statistics, and it is one of the more popular choices recently. And it has a lot of advantages that the other popular ones don't have. So if you have any work on the statistics it was using to identify those 4 different signals, and you don't mind sending them to me or showing how I'd find them, I'd like to read up more about them.
You'll find chunks of it in Decision and Control and Brain of the Firm off the top of my head, but undoubtedly in multiple other papers. But we can pick up the sources later. David.
I'm unmuted. It strikes me looking at the railway system, which I frequently do from a railway window between Axminster and Crewkerne. An awful lot of your overall issue is weather forecasting, which isn't a unique issue for the railway system. Masses of progress, it seemed to me, was made by the MIT people who produced the Dark Sky program, which I now think they've sold to Microsoft, which one of the big corps anyway, which is commercializing it and not really developing its success. Obviously, an awful lot of other agencies than the railways are into improving weather forecasting, and I'm wondering whether you have a sense of any kind of trajectory of how far and how much that improvement is likely to go. And again, I suppose you don't need to predict the future if your infrastructure and your technology is good enough to survive anything. So I can see sort of 2 different approaches there by which you can solve or fudge these issues. But I'm just, partly thinking, how far you can steal other people's solutions, or how far you see the railway system as entirely unique.
So I'll answer that, because I've probably been more deeply embedded in this for longer than Matt and Corneliu. The weather forecasting is quite interesting. So there's a particular thing called the convective alert tool that runs at 5-kilometre grids along the line of railway at 5-minute forecast intervals. So almost like the weather radar that you might see on something like Formula One, where they're predicting rain on a racing circuit. But and that stuff is fed through, and they have alarms that go off, and people can respond to them. But of course, they're very now. So you can alert a driver, you can maybe slow a train down now, and deal with the effect of that. When you move out then to 3, 4, and 5 days out, so in order to be able to manage a crisis, for example, it's better if we know the crisis is coming. And if we're forecasting a crisis in 3 days' time, then we can put a temporary timetable in place that limits the impact of the crisis on the people that are travelling. Now, all that good stuff actually happens at the moment. but they do it, Richard, forgive me for saying this out loud, they do it kind of blind. The basis on which some of those decisions are being made is it defaults to safe, which is probably a good thing, but it probably means we're cancelling services when we shouldn't, slowing trains down when we didn't need to. So the impact on the passengers, and if you measure everything in terms of, if the purpose of the railway is to move goods and people and people around from various points A to various points B, if we are organisationally inefficient in doing that and ineffective in doing it, then we haven't got a particularly good railway. So delivering the purpose of the railway effectively and efficiently requires us to be able to make better decisions about how and when to run trains despite the weather. I think it's fair to say that there will never be a point with a 200-year-old 20,000-mile long 30-yard wide railway when we'll be in prime condition, David. Does that kind of answer the question?
Kind of. How far it's going to improve. I'm fed up of having to drive because I can't rely on the system, but whatever.
So one of the events I ran recently with some other people was for the Infrastructure Projects Authority, and the presenting question was, what's the value of resilience? And how do you persuade the Treasury, which, picking up Elena's point, is very focused, the top down, very focused on how can I have more railway cheap is basically the question they're asking. And of course, cheap railways are ones that you don't maintain very well, like cheap roads are ones you don't maintain very well. They look cheap and/or they transfer the cost into somebody else's pocket. But the reality is there must be somewhere a practical limit to how much we can invest in a railway in order to get the service. And frankly, at the moment, I don't think anybody knows what the answer to that question is in that sense.
More plausible models, even if they're false, might help you.
Yeah, and this is kind of, is this a plausible model? Is this helping will this help the industry to think differently and better about the way it organises and manages and maintains its assets? Because then if it does, then it reduces the number of failures. If it reduces the number of failures, then people like you are more inclined to catch trains because you can trust them. So there's a sort of there's a tail that goes all the way from can we make this decision and do we have the information to, and David Dewhurst is now catching more trains more often because he's got greater faith in the system. And there's a whole organisational architecture that sort of sits between those two points, and we're kind of working away at the engine room of decision making in that sense, in order to inform a better railway, which ultimately informs a more informed consumer. Will be where we'd kind of like to get to. Angela, you've been listening to all this very patiently and maybe mentally comparing some of the cases you've been working on with what you've seen and heard from Matthew and Corneliu. What are your thoughts?
I found fascinating the two projects. I have several thoughts in my mind. Like, for instance, one for Matthew. I think that there are so many relationships between cybernetics and artificial intelligence that perhaps, I mean, with no doubt, is something that needs to deepen, and a very exciting field. I guess that just clarifying this relationship in itself is a really interesting, maybe a very interesting output of your research, because in a way, cybernetics remain like the mother science, artificial intelligence like the modern, fashionable kind of thing. But I haven't seen anyone that had made a real connection and sort of close the loop about what is the new cybernetics, including all these developments on artificial intelligence, robotics, social sciences, second order cybernetics, organizational cybernetics, and so also at that level, I think that very interesting what you will learn about. And on the other side, about Corneliu as well and his research, I guess that very interesting, like the relationship between what the data, I mean, the uncertainty on the data and the decision making, I mean, you are going to have to make a decision at some point regarding the focus you want to go. Do you want to focus on the organizational aspect of decision making, or the data aspects, that the data that is important to make the decision? Because there are two fields that can be taken completely different. No, if you get more the data approach, you will be more into the scientific kind of research, more abstract, more looking at the data. But if you go deeper into try to understand the issues of uncertainty and issues of decision making, then you will find out the human aspects, and at some point, I guess that you are going to have to make a choice and decide which way to go. Both of them are really important. Both of them are completely interconnected, but the way of approaching will be completely different, I guess. But I think that, again, very, very important issues of understanding uncertainty, understanding decisions, because this, especially in this moment in climate change, as you say, this is something that is becoming too important for us, and many of the traditional ways in which you make decisions are no longer useful, because everything is changing so rapidly that we really need to discover new ways of thinking about that. So yeah, just very well surprised with both the projects, and very happy to talk more if I'm useful at any time.
Brilliant, thank you, Angela. And there is a third project that the third student has literally started in the last couple of weeks. The third project is concerned with the cultural questions and organizational questions of Network Rail, and how the good work that Corneliu and Matthew were doing can actually then get translated into the practice of operating the organization. So we will be going from the sort of the fundamentals of cybernetics that Matthew's been sort of talking about there, through the challenges of decision making into but actually how do we persuade the people in the organization to rely on the machines, and the recommendations that are coming, because actually, in order to run the railway properly, and I choose the word properly quite carefully, they will need to learn to trust the computers and trust the models, and that's a really interesting sort of cultural challenge for any organization, but let alone one that is steeped in shoveling more coal in the boiler and preferring a steam engine over these nasty diesel electric things that we run these days. So yeah, there is sort of there's a great tradition in the railway that people and that digital transition. And it's not just for the railways, and the railways is our case tonight. The digital transition that traditional organisations are going to have to go through if they're going to survive in the next 5 to 10 years, and taking advantage of the systems that are available to them, is going to be quite interesting. Rory, as ever, you get in just in time.
John, Raul has a question.
Yeah, sorry, Raul, go on.
Yes, I just put it a long time ago, but I was waiting for you to come all the way to Valencia. No, this is a very, very simple question. And something that changes the background of everything. This is not for you, John. It's for Matthew and Corneliu. How is that you recognize the difference between systems thinking and cybernetics? How do you connect the two things? Are they the same or not?
I think that they are very similar, and I think cybernetics uses systems thinking. I think cybernetics is more specifically systems that have free will, systems that can control themselves, information and change their own behavior. So cybernetics is most just specifically about those kinds of systems, but to effectively use it, you need to learn systems thinking on top. That's how I think.
And Corneliu?
I don't think they're the same either. while system thinking is looking particularly at systems. I think cybernetics, at least that's my understanding of it now, is that this goes beyond that. So through other things like artificial intelligence, mathematics, and tries to, I see it as a facilitator or a connector between all of these things. So system thinking to artificial intelligence, for example, or in my case, transport planning, because I'm a transport planner as a foundation. So for me, cybernetics is the connector between system thinking and transport planning. Yeah.
And your answer, Raoul?
Sorry?
And your answer?
My thinking about that is that cybernetics is very strongly connected with mechanisms. So is it very strongly connected with design? On the other hand, systems thinking is very connected to the way the parts are connected, related, and all the whole can be recognized from a whole set of distributed parts. So it's something to think about, and I would suggest that you make this distinction in your research for the future.
I think that's fair point. I have this thing at the moment which I haven't fully worked out, that there is a lot of what we call systems thinking reduces our systemic understanding to a set of alternative methodologies. So I think there is thinking systemically, which is a way of thinking about the world, and then there are systems thinking methodologies which kind of reduce that. And there's an interesting space in there somewhere about what do we really mean by and I actually wrote it down. Angela, when you were speaking, I actually sort of wrote in there that there was something about that was sort of coming into my head as you were describing some of the work, and it's one when we meet early in May, we'll chew that one up over a cup of coffee. Rory, very quick question because we're nearly out of time.
Oh, it was just another tidbit, which was for the change management part, the culture section of the PhD. An interesting thing to look at would be diffusion of innovation. That from, what's his name? Can't remember his name, but that was introduced to me by Peter Kowalek, so I thought I would mention it. Heavily researched stuff, so I thought I'd just quickly pop it in at the end.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Listen, Angela, Matthew, Corneliu, fantastic. Thank you very, very much for all the energy you put in. As ever, we've captured it on the recording system. We'll get it onto YouTube as soon as possible so you can play it back and enjoy yourselves with it. But absolutely fantastic, really brilliant 2 hours. Thank you all very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.
Bye.
Bye.